The small town of Brooksville was known for its quiet charm, nestled in the heart of the Midwest. As I drove down the winding roads, I couldn't help but notice how peaceful everything seemed. My name is Mark Harris, a journalist for a national newspaper. I had come to Brooksville to investigate a series of brutal murders that had left the town on edge. "Be careful, Mark," warned my editor before I left. "This isn't just another story. People are scared." I brushed off his concerns, confident in my abilities. But as I arrived in town and felt the palpable tension, I began to realize this was different. I checked into the town's only motel, where the owner, Mr. Thompson, a wiry man with a cautious demeanor, handed me a key. "Room 5, he said, his eyes darting around nervously. "You're the journalist, right? Hear about the murders?" "That's right," I replied, taking the key. "Anything you can tell me?" Mr. Thompson hesitated. "Just be careful. Folks around here are on edge." After settling into my room, I decided to visit the local diner, hoping to gather some information. The diner, a quaint place called Maggie's, was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Linda, eyed me curiously. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," I admitted. "I'm a journalist, investigating the murders." Linda's expression turned grim. "It's been awful. People are scared to go out after dark. They say it's the work of an escaped convict." "Escaped convict?" I asked, leaning in. "Yeah," she whispered, glancing around. "His name is Jake Marshall. He broke out of the state hospital a few months ago. Been hiding out in the woods ever since." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you believe that?" Linda shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that people are dying." As I left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The streets were eerily quiet, and shadows seemed to loom larger than life. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of my room. But just as I turned the corner, a hand grabbed my arm. I spun around to see an elderly woman, her eyes wide with fear. "You need to be careful," she whispered. "He's watching." "Who are you?" I asked, my heart pounding. "My name is Mrs. Johnson," she replied. "I know about Jake. Meet me at the library tomorrow at noon. I can tell you everything." With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving me standing there, bewildered and more than a little afraid. The next morning, I made my way to the Brooksville Public Library. The building was an old brick structure with ivy creeping up its walls, a testament to the town's history. As I entered, the scent of aged paper and polished wood greeted me. Mrs. Johnson was already there, sitting at a table in the back, a stack of old newspapers and a thick, leather-bound book in front of her. "Good morning," she said, motioning for me to sit. "I thought you might need some context." "Thank you," I replied, taking a seat. "So, who is Jake Marshall?" Mrs. Johnson sighed. "Jake was a local boy, troubled from a young age. His family lived on the outskirts of town, near the woods. When he was 16, his parents were found dead in their home, and Jake was found nearby, covered in their blood. He was sent to the state hospital for the criminally insane." "Why did he escape?" I asked. "No one knows for sure," she replied, her eyes darkening. "But since his escape, there have been whispers. People say they've seen him in the woods, and then the murders started. Do you think he's responsible?" I pressed. Mrs. Johnson hesitated. "I don't know. But I do know that the killings match the brutality of his parents' deaths." As we spoke, the door to the library creaked open, and a tall man in a police uniform stepped in. He approached us with a look of mild irritation. "Mrs. Johnson, you really shouldn't be scaring people with these old stories," he said, his tone condescending. "Officer James, this is Mark Harris," Mrs. Johnson said, ignoring his comment. "He's here to investigate the murders." James turned to me, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Harris, I appreciate your interest, but we have the situation under control. There's no need to stir up the town with rumors." "I'm just trying to find the truth," I replied, meeting his gaze. James sighed. "Look, I know people are scared. But spreading stories about Jake Marshall isn't helping. We have no solid evidence that he's involved." "Then what do you think is happening?" I asked. "We're exploring all possibilities," James said evasively. "Just stay safe, and let us do our job." As he walked away, Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "James means well, but he's too proud to admit he's out of his depth." "Thank you for your help," I said to Mrs. Johnson. "I'll be careful." That evening, I decided to take a walk through the town, hoping to get a feel for the place and perhaps stumble upon more clues. The streets were quiet, with only a few people out and about, their faces drawn and wary. I found myself drawn towards the woods on the edge of town, where the trees stood like silent sentinels in the fading light. As I ventured deeper, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I had just about decided to turn back when I heard a noise, a faint rustling, followed by a low, guttural growl. My heart pounded as I turned towards the sound, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. A shadow moved between the trees, and I caught a glimpse of a figure, hunched and menacing. Without thinking, I began to run, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods and into the clearing by the main road. Gasping for breath, I looked back, but the figure was gone. Trembling, I hurried back to the motel, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. As I reached my room, I found a note slipped under the door. It was a single piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message: "You were seen. Stop digging or you'll be next." The next morning, I knew I had to find more solid evidence. I decided to visit the town's archives, hoping to uncover more about Jake Marshall and his past. The archives were located in the basement of the town hall, a musty room filled with dusty files and forgotten records. I spent hours combing through old newspapers, police reports, and hospital records. What I found was disturbing. Jake Marshall had a history of violent behavior from a young age, with numerous reports of animal cruelty and aggressive outbursts. His parents' deaths were particularly brutal, their bodies mutilated in a manner strikingly similar to the recent murders. As I pieced together the timeline, a pattern began to emerge. The murders were not random but seemed to follow a twisted logic. Each victim had some connection to Jake's past, people who had wronged him or his family in some way. I was deep in thought when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number: "Meet me at the old church at midnight. I have information." Against my better judgment, I decided to go. The old church was a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. As I approached, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding settled over me. I entered the church, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Mrs. Johnson. "I didn't know who else to trust," she said, her voice trembling. "I found something." She handed me a small, leather-bound book. "It's Jake's diary," she said. "I found it in the attic of his old house. It might have the answers you're looking for." Back in my motel room, I opened the diary with trembling hands. The leather cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. As I began to read, Jake Marshall's tortured thoughts spilled out in shaky handwriting. The entries started innocuously enough, descriptions of his daily life, mentions of his parents, and his struggles at school. But as I read on, the tone grew darker. He wrote about the voices he heard, voices that urged him to do terrible things. He described his growing anger and frustration, and his feelings of isolation and abandonment. One entry stood out. It was dated just a few days before his parents' murder. June 3, 1985. The voices won't stop. They tell me to hurt them, to make them pay. I can't ignore them anymore. I have to do it. They say it will make everything better. June 5, 1985. It's done. They're gone. But the voices, they haven't stopped. They say I need to do more, to finish what I started. I'm scared, but I don't have a choice. The final entry was more recent, written after his escape from the hospital. March 10, 2024. I'm free. The voices led me out, told me where to go. They want me to continue. The people here, they deserve it. They've forgotten what they did. I'll remind them. As I closed the diary, a sense of dread settled over me. Jake Marshall wasn't just a killer, he believed he was on a mission, driven by the voices in his head. And he wasn't finished. Determined to stop Jake, I decided to gather all the information I had and present it to Officer James. Despite his earlier skepticism, he needed to know the truth. I also reached out to Mrs. Johnson, who had proven to be a valuable ally. We met at the police station, where James listened as I laid out everything I had discovered, the diary, the pattern of the murders, and the connection to Jake's past. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is a lot to take in," he said finally. "But it makes sense. We need to act fast." Together, we formulated a plan. James would increase patrols around the town, focusing on areas connected to Jake's past. Mrs. Johnson and I would continue our research, looking for any additional clues that might help us predict Jake's next move. As we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Jake was out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he had completed his twisted mission. Over the next few days, the tension in Brooksville grew palpable. The streets emptied at night, and a sense of fear hung in the air. Despite our efforts, Jake remained elusive, and the body count continued to rise. One evening, while poring over old maps and records with Mrs. Johnson, I had an idea. Jake's diary mentioned specific locations where he felt wronged. What if we could predict his next target? "Look," I said, pointing to a map. "The murders form a pattern. They circle around this area, the old sawmill." It was his father's workplace, where he felt neglected and abused. Mrs. Johnson nodded. "If he's following his past, that might be his next stop." We quickly informed James, who agreed to set a trap at the sawmill. That night, a team of officers surrounded the building, waiting in silence. As midnight approached, the tension was unbearable. Then, a figure emerged from the woods, moving stealthily towards the sawmill. It was Jake. James signaled his team, and they moved in. But Jake was quick, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. A chase ensued, with Jake leading the officers on a wild pursuit through the darkened forest. I watched from a distance, heart pounding, as the sounds of the chase grew fainter. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. One of the officers had fallen, his body lying motionless on the ground. Fueled by a mixture of fear and determination, I followed the sounds deeper into the forest. I found Jake standing over the fallen officer, a knife glinting in his hand. "Jake!" I shouted, stepping into the clearing. "It's over. You don't have to do this." Jake turned to me, his eyes wild. You don't understand. They need to pay. They all need to pay. You're not well, Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The voices aren't real. This isn't the way. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or fear. But then it was gone, replaced by cold resolve. I have to finish this, he said, raising the knife. Before I could react, James burst into the clearing, gun drawn. Drop the knife, Jake, he commanded. Jake hesitated, and in that split second, James lunged, tackling him to the ground. The two struggled, but James managed to pin Jake down, wrenching the knife from his hand. It's over, James said, breathing heavily. You're going back. With Jake in custody, the town of Brooksville began to breathe a little easier. The immediate danger had passed, but the scars remained. The townsfolk slowly returned to their routines, though the memory of the murders would linger for a long time. I wrote my article, detailing the horrors that had unfolded and the bravery of those who had stood up to Jake. It was a story of fear and madness, but also of resilience and hope. As I prepared to leave Brooksville, I visited Mrs. Johnson one last time. She stood on her porch, looking out over the town she had lived in all her life. Thank you for your help, I said. I couldn't have done it without you. She smiled, a bittersweet expression. Take care, Mark. And remember, the past always finds a way to catch up with us. It's how we face it that defines who we are. Driving away, I couldn't help but reflect on her words. Brooksville had faced its past and come out stronger. And as for me, I had learned that sometimes, the truth is more terrifying than any fiction. The village of San Andres was a quiet, picturesque place, nestled among the lush greenery of the Philippines. Life moved at a gentle pace here, with the villagers going about their daily routines under the watchful gaze of the surrounding mountains. My name is Carlo, and this is where I grew up, surrounded by the familiar faces of friends and family. But recently, something had changed. A sense of unease had settled over San Andres, and whispers of a vengeful spirit began to circulate among the villagers. They spoke of a woman named Rosa, whose soul could not rest. One evening, I was sitting with my friend Miguel at the local sari-sari store, sipping on a cold beer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. Have you heard the latest? Miguel asked, his voice low. They say Rosa has returned. I chuckled, trying to mask my discomfort. Come on, Miguel. You know how people love their ghost stories. Miguel's expression remained serious. It's not just stories, Carlo. People have been seeing things. Shadows moving on their own, whispers in the night. My grandmother even said she saw Rosa's face in her window. I shrugged it off, but that night, as I walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air was thick with humidity, and the cicadas were louder than usual. As I reached my house, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed to move on its own. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, and went inside. The next day, I decided to visit Lolo Ben, the village elder. If anyone knew about the legend of Rosa, it would be him. Lolo Ben was sitting on his porch, smoking a pipe, when I arrived. Magandang umaga, Lolo, I greeted him. Magandang umaga, Carlo, he replied, a twinkle in his eye. What brings you here? I wanted to ask you about Rosa, I said, taking a seat next to him. Miguel says people are seeing her again. Lolo Ben sighed, taking a long puff from his pipe. Rosa's story is a tragic one. She was a beautiful young woman, madly in love with a man named Antonio. But Antonio was unfaithful. In her despair, Rosa took her own life, cursing him with her dying breath. They say her spirit has never found peace. Why would she come back now? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Lolo Ben shook his head. Sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with us. If Rosa's spirit is restless, it means there is unfinished business. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows in my room seemed to move, and I kept hearing whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. I felt a presence, a cold, lingering touch that made my skin crawl. A few nights later, as I was walking back from Miguel's house, I heard a soft, melodic humming. It was a haunting tune, carried on the wind. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming led me to an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of the village. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the humming grew louder. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Suddenly, the humming stopped, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I spun around to see a woman standing there. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Rosa," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "You cannot escape me, Carlo. You owe me." Before I could react, she disappeared, leaving me alone in the darkness. I stumbled out of the house, my heart racing, and ran all the way back to my house. Determined to find out more about Rosa, I decided to search my family's old belongings. My grandparents had lived in San Andres all their lives, and I hoped to find something that could help me understand Rosa's connection to me. In the attic, I found an old, dusty journal belonging to my great-grandfather. As I flipped through the pages, I discovered a series of entries about Rosa and her family. My great-grandfather had been friends with Rosa's father, and there were mentions of frequent visits to their home. One entry caught my eye. June 5, 1925. Today, I visited the home of Rosa and her family. Her father seems troubled, speaking of dark omens and restless spirits. Rosa herself looks pale, as if the life is being drained from her. I fear there is more to this than meets the eye. I continued reading, piecing together the story. Rosa's father had been a local healer, known for his knowledge of herbal remedies and spiritual rituals. But one day, he had crossed a powerful sorcerer, who cursed their family. It was this curse that had driven Rosa to despair and, ultimately, to her tragic end. Armed with the knowledge from my great-grandfather's journal, I knew I had to delve deeper into Rosa's past and the curse that plagued her family. I sought out more information, visiting the older members of the village and poring over any records I could find. One evening, I was in the village square when I ran into Tita Elin, one of the oldest residents. She was known for her vast knowledge of local folklore and history. "Tita Elin," I called out, approaching her. "May I ask you something about Rosa and her family?" She eyed me suspiciously for a moment, then nodded. "Come, let's sit." We found a quiet spot, and I told her everything I had learned from the journal. Tita Elin listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "You are brave to seek the truth, Carlo," she said finally. Rosa's father, Don Pedro, was a man of great wisdom but also great pride. He thought he could challenge the sorcerer, known as Mang Adair, without consequences. "What happened?" I asked, leaning forward. "Mang Adair cursed Don Pedro's bloodline," she explained. "He vowed that no member of his family would find peace, in life or in death. Rosa was the first victim, but the curse continued to affect her descendants. A cold realization settled over me. So, Rosa's spirit is still restless because of this curse. Tita Elin nodded. And now, for some reason, she has chosen you. With each passing day, the haunting grew more intense. Rosa's presence was everywhere, her whispers in the wind, her shadow in the corner of my eye. She appeared in my dreams, her eyes filled with a sorrowful rage. One night, I awoke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She reached out, her touch as cold as ice. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You have something that belongs to me," she replied, her voice echoing with anguish. "I want it back." "What is it?" I demanded, desperate for answers. "You will know soon enough," she whispered, before fading into the darkness. The next morning, I knew I had to do something. I decided to visit Lolo Ben again, hoping he could help me break the curse and free Rosa's spirit. "Lolo Ben, I need your help," I said as I arrived at his home. "Rosa's haunting me, and I don't know why." Lolo Ben looked at me with a mixture of pity and determination. "Carlo, the curse that binds Rosa is strong, but it can be broken. We must perform a ritual to release her spirit." "How do we do that?" I asked, eager to find a solution. "We will need items connected to Rosa's life and death," he explained. "An object she cherished, soil from her grave, and a symbol of her family's lineage." I spent the next few days gathering the necessary items. With the help of Miguel and Tita Elin, we located an old locket that had belonged to Rosa, collected soil from the neglected graveyard where she was buried, and found an heirloom that had been passed down through her family. On the night of the full moon, we gathered in the forest clearing where Rosa had taken her own life. The air was thick with tension, and a sense of foreboding hung over us. Lolo Ben began the ritual, chanting ancient words and lighting candles around the circle we had drawn. I held the items tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. As the ritual progressed, the air grew colder, and a dense fog enveloped us. Suddenly, Rosa appeared, her ghostly figure hovering above the ground. "You cannot free me," she hissed, her eyes glowing with anger. "The curse binds me to this world." "We will break the curse," Lolo Ben declared, his voice steady. "You will find peace, Rosa." With a final chant, Lolo Ben instructed me to place the items in the center of the circle. The candles flickered, and a powerful wind howled through the clearing. Rosa let out a piercing scream, and for a moment, I thought the ritual had failed. Then, as quickly as it began, the wind died down, and the fog lifted. Rosa's figure shimmered, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I am free." With that, she vanished, leaving us in the quiet of the night. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, knowing that Rosa's spirit had finally found peace. The village of San Andres slowly returned to normal. The whispers of a vengeful spirit faded, replaced by stories of how we had bravely faced the curse and triumphed. I reflected on the events that had transpired, grateful for the support of my friends and the wisdom of Lolo Ben and Tita Elin. Life in the village went on, but I knew that I would never forget the ordeal. One day, as I was walking through the village, Miguel approached me with a concerned expression. "Carlo, I found something," he said, handing me an old photograph. The photograph was of a young woman, Rosa. But standing next to her was a man who bore a striking resemblance to me. "That's my great-grandfather," I said, shocked. He and Rosa were more connected than I realized. Miguel nodded. "It seems the past has a way of finding us, no matter how hard we try to escape it." I took the photograph, a sense of unease settling over me. The ordeal with Rosa was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered.